In this exercise, we're going to be retouching a portrait using some of the basic retouching tools in Photoshop. So go ahead and find a portrait. It can either be your own or you can find something on the internet. Just find something pretty high resolution, because if you're working with a very small file, you're going to run into some issues where the pixelation is preventing you from understanding the tools. So just find something pretty large. Something shot on a smartphone is totally fine. So I have a shot here of this guy, and with retouching, basically we're going to go through and remove some blemishes or some unwanted items from the skin. Okay, so this is a really common technique in portraiture to go back and just clean up the skin a little bit. And there's almost this little bit of an ethical decision that you have to make in terms of how much to clean up someone's skin. You know, definitely things like blemishes are very common to remove. But if it's a part of the person, then you probably want to leave it alone, because you don't want to change the way the person looks. You just want to, take away any temporary problems that they might be, having. So things like pimples or other blemishes or scars are usually good to get away from. If it's more of a permanent scar, then it's kind of a judgment call. But changing something like freckles is usually not what you want to do. That being said, if you're working on a commercial product line, a lot of times the retouching is much more heavy, where they'll really go in and perfect the skin, almost to an extreme where it becomes really unnatural. So kind of depends on what you're doing, but just be aware that there is kind of an ethical decision that has to be made when you're retouching. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the clone stamp tool. This is one of the most classic tools in Photoshop, and you can reach it just by pressing the S key. And the way clone stamp works is by just sampling an area and using it to paint over another area. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on this guy's face. You can see we have a few kind of blemishes up here. And let's start by kind of removing this little dark spot. Okay, so if I want to use the clone stamp tool, I'm going to grab that tool. And usually it's actually best to work with 100% hardness on the clone stamp tool. Okay, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to just size my brush up a little bit so it's good enough to cover up that area. And then basically what you want to do is sample an area, and you do that by holding down Option. Okay, so when I hold down Option, you can see this little crosshairs pop up. I'm going to sample a clean part of the skin. Okay, so I'm holding down Option. I clicked to create a sample point. Okay, and then when I release, now you can see that what is inside of the brush is coming from that area. Okay, so if I click and paint, you can see as I'm painting, there's a little crosshair up and to the left from where I'm painting. That's because it's showing me that I'm sampling from that area. Okay, so I sampled that part of the skin and used what was there to paint over what was here to cover up that blemish. So that's basically the way the clone stamp works. Just to show you a more extreme example, if I sampled this eye, right? So I'm holding down Option, I'm clicking on this eye, then I go up here and paint. Okay, so I can start painting, and you can see that I'm basically like painting using the other part of the image. Okay, so I'm actually like painting an eye because I've sampled the area of the eye and I'm painting that over the forehead. So obviously this is not what we want to do in terms of retouching, but it's a good way to just show you that this is how the clone stamp works. Basically, I'm just selecting an area and then I'm painting, and it's just going to paint that area that I sampled from right over the part that I am actually brushing. Okay, so that's how that works. I'm going to go ahead and hold down Option and Command and hit Z a couple times to undo what I just did there. Okay, so that's the basic way that clone stamp works. But one quick problem here is that I actually did this in a destructive way because I had the background selected. So now that blemish is permanently gone from this guy's skin. So that is destructive because we've actually, modified that original layer. So I'm going to go ahead and undo, the removal of that blemish. And instead of going right on top of the background layer, what I'm going to do is click this button to create a new layer on top. Okay, so now I have a layer here. I'm selected that layer, which means I'm drawing on that layer. And then up here where it says sample, I have a few different options, when I have the clone stamp selected. And, if I do current layer, it's not going to actually work because there's nothing on that current layer that I'm working on. All of the information is on the background layer. So what I want to select is actually current and below. So basically what it's going to do is when I'm sampling, it's going to sample from all of the layers below and including this current layer. So it's going to pick up the information from that background layer, which is what I want, but it's going to place it on this clean layer. Okay, so I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to go in here and do the same thing. I'm going to sample a little bit of skin from here. Then I'm going to paint over that blemish. Okay, so it does the same thing that it was doing before, but now if I turn off the background layer, just so you can see what I'm doing, you can see that this new piece of skin that I painted on is actually on top. It's on a separate layer from that original layer. So if I turn off this new layer that I created, and I can go ahead and just double click in here to give this a name like Retouching. Okay, so it's good to do that just so you always know what these layers are doing. But if I turn that layer off and on, you can see that that blemish comes back, because when it's off, I don't have this piece of skin that's covering up that blemish. Okay, so this is a way to work non-destructively, because once again, that background layer is not going to be affected. It's exactly how it was before. Okay, so that's the way the clone stamp works, and we can do that, you know, to work on some basic areas. It's a pretty manual tool, and it's one of the reasons why it's one of the oldest tools in Photoshop. It's because it's actually a really, really simple tool. Okay, so let's look at a little bit more of an advanced tool. I'm going to go up here to the spot healing brush. Okay, so you can do this by clicking J. Underneath the spot healing brush, there's a few other things, but the one at the top is the spot healing brush. And when you do that, you know, you're going to want to click sample all layers again, just to make sure that we're sampling from the actual background layer as well. Okay, and then under type, you're going to want to have content aware selected. This is the way to use the tool best. Okay, so this is a little bit of a smarter tool. And when I click on a blemish, like there's a little bit of a nick here, I click on that, and I can also click and paint. So it's going to kind of select a little bit of an area, and then it's going to do some calculations, and it's going to figure out how to remove that blemish. So it's actually going to, you know, get rid of the blemish, but it's going to sample the skin around it to find some texture to sample over that. Okay, so it's a tool that is really smart, especially for things like these little blemishes. You can just go really quick and just sort of take things out. And if you have a bigger area, you can paint over that larger area. And it's generally going to do a pretty good job. In some cases, it might remove a little bit too much of the texture, but overall, it's going to work pretty well. And you know, you can make the brush bigger. So if you want to paint over a larger area, you can do that. You can even try to paint over this whole area where there's a little bit of redness. Okay, and it did like a pretty decent job. If I zoom out, it actually looks a little bit artificial, but you know, it didn't do too bad. I can always go back and clean up those edges just a little bit. Okay, so that's how the spot healing brush works. Generally speaking, it's the best way to clean up skin. And once again, you can go through here and, you know, spend a lot of time cleaning up all these little nicks. Up to you how clean you want to make the image. I actually think that, you know, I probably went too far here, where I took away a lot of freckles and wrinkles and things that are really part of this person. So I went a little too far, and now it's kind of feeling a little fake, like the skin went a little plastic on me. So just be aware that, you know, the further you go, the more, you know, that you're going to start to take away from the character of a person. Okay, so again, if I go back and look at that retouching layer, it's actually kind of gross, but you can see that there's all these little pieces of skin that have been sampled that are covering up those blemishes. So if I turn that off and on, you can see that we've really cleaned up that forehead and made it really smooth. Okay, so that works pretty good. This nose is a little bit of a trickier area because you know, it's kind of big, and it's on a part of the skin that is very contoured. So there's a certain contour to this where there's kind of a highlight on the bridge of the nose, and then it gets a little bit darker as it goes down the sides. So if I wanted to like use the spot healing brush to clean up this kind of redness and all the, you know, blemishes here, get a little bit tricky, because you can see it kind of created this flat spot where it sampled a little bit of the darker color. And if I zoom out, you can see it kind of created a little bit of an issue on that nose. So it didn't do a very good job with the spot healing brush. So we could try to use the clone stamp, but you know, this is a good time to actually use the regular healing brush, which works kind of similar. It's almost like a mix of the clone stamp and the healing brush and the spot healing brush. Okay, so just like the clone stamp, you're going to sample from a certain area, but unlike the clone stamp, which is just going to literally paint from that area and paint it on top, it's going to try to blend, you know, the sampled area and the new area together just a bit to create a bit more of a seamless situation. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and sample from kind of a cleaner part of the skin here, Okay, and then I can just sort of paint over, and actually I need to go ahead and change the sample to current and below. So since I was on current, it's actually not going to do anything, right? Because I'm trying to sample from a layer that is pretty much blank. So instead I'm going to go to current and below. And once again, I'm going to sample, and I can start to paint over some of this area. Okay, and so this is going to start covering things up, but since I'm doing it manually, I have a little bit more control over what part of the image I'm sampling from. So I can be a little bit more selective and sample from an area that is more similar to the part of the nose that I want to clean up. Okay, so I can be a little bit more selective and make sure that I'm leaving in some of the shading that is kind of defining that nose. And I can use this in conjunction with the spot hitting brush. If I'm just trying to remove like little dots, I can I can do that. Again, you don't want to go too far. But for those bigger areas, this can be a little bit trickier, and for those tricky areas, a lot of times the regular healing brush is the way to go. So once again, I'm going to go through here, okay, and just start to clean this up. Okay, so that's probably good enough. Again, I don't want to go too far with cleaning this up. I want to leave some of that, some of the freckles and the kind of spot there, but I don't want to have all those blemishes. Okay, so if I turn off my retouching layer, you can see I've removed quite a few blemishes from the face. You definitely could go through and do some more, but that's pretty much good enough for this area. Okay, so that's some basic retouching. Let's also lighten this image up because it feels a little bit dark. Okay, so once again, I'm going to go down and make an adjustment layer. I'm going to go up to levels. So the levels adjustment layer is going to sit right on top of everything else, which means it's going to affect everything below it. Okay, so if I bring my white point in, I can just brighten this up a little bit, maybe bring out some of that shadow detail again. So if I click this on and off, you can see that I've gone to something a little dark and flat to something that feels a little brighter, and I feel like this guy's personality is starting to emerge. Okay, so it is important that this comes on top though, because if it's in between, right? So now what's happened is I've lightened up the background image, but I didn't lighten up all those little patches of skin. Okay, so now there's a problem where those skin patches are darker than the background because the background's been lightened up, but those skin patches haven't. Okay, so just make sure your layer stack is done in the correct way, and then it's gonna look good to go. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Last thing that we can work on is using the crop tool. Okay, so this is a way to just make your image a little bigger or a little bit smaller. So when I select the crop tool, I can bring in these sides and actually crop in. So if I wanted a tighter crop, maybe I didn't want so much of that background, I can crop in, and then when I click check, it's going to delete all the area around it. Okay, so if I hit check, I'm just going to be left with what was there. Okay, so I'm going to actually undo that because I want to show you one more thing, which is if I uncheck this button that says delete cropped pixels, then I can work in a non-destructive way. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do that same crop with that not checked. And the nice thing about that is if I decide I didn't want to crop so much, I can go back to the crop tool and I can actually uncrop, and you can see that that part of the image is still there. It was just hidden from view. So if I change my mind and I want to go back out and use the original crop, then I'm able to do that. Okay, so cropping is up to you, but it's a good compositional tool to get a certain focus on an area. So if you have a portrait that's really wide and you really want to focus in on the face, you can crop down to that face to bring more focus to that one area. Okay, so this is ready to go. Last thing I just need to do is save it. So if I go to File and Save As, I want to talk a little bit about the different format options that are available in Photoshop. And one of the main ones you want to use is just the Photoshop format itself. That's a PSD file, and the nice thing about a Photoshop format is it's going to retain all of your layers. So it's always good to save at least one PSD, and as long as you have this thing clicked that says layers, you're going to retain all these layers, so you're always going to be able to come back and make any changes to those layers whenever you want. You can also use a TIFF, and TIFF also retains layers, so you can see that that layers button is available when I choose the TIFF format. So either PSD or TIFF is a good way to go. I'm just going to go ahead and save a PSD to start here. Okay, and this thing's going to come up. I'm just going to go ahead and have maximize compatibility checked. Okay, and now I have portrait.psd. So if I want to create a JPEG, which is a good final output because it's much smaller of a file, now I can go up to File and Save As and choose a JPEG. So now that I have the PSD file with all the layers, the JPEG is a good way to give this to a client or turn it in for this assignment, but you're not going to want to have it be your only file format because you can see that this layers is not available. Okay, so since layers are not available, when I save it as a JPEG, I'm going to save it as portrait 2 since I already have a portrait.jpg here already. When I save this, it's going to flatten all these layers. So if I return to that file, I'm not going to be able to work in that non-destructive way. Okay, so since I have the PSD, I'm good to go, and I can click Save. And with JPEG, you have to choose an amount of compression. So you're usually going to want to be on the high side, somewhere between 8 and 10 is usually good. If for some reason you need a really small file size, you might venture into the mediums and lows, but you don't want to go too far because it'll look really bad. Okay, so just keep it somewhere towards the top. Usually 12 is unnecessary, but 10 is a good value to choose by default. Okay, so I'm going to click 10 and click OK. Okay, and now I have a JPEG version of this photo as well. So I'm still working in my PSD, but if I bring up that JPEG, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that up over here. And if I open up that JPEG in Photoshop by dragging down and releasing it over the Photoshop icon, okay, you can see that it's that same image that I was working with before, but I don't have any of those layers anymore. Okay, so that's why it's good to work with the PSD. The layers are going to be retained. With the JPEG, I have a smaller file size, and if I go back here, you can look that the JPEG is 1.9 megabytes, where the PSD is 64 megabytes. So the JPEG really helped us by compressing our file size down, but it got rid of those layers. So this is kind of for us so that we can go back and work on what we're doing, and the JPEG is for the client delivery, and it's a really good way to create a high quality image without having such a large file size.